bicarbonate? And I imagine, Jan, you would have, in your early days, just used stock standard sodium bicarbonate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I used it without a scale, so definitely mixed results. It was either baking or it was cleaning. It was cleaning me out in a way you don't necessarily want to see.
Welcome to FuelIn Sessions, the podcast that dives into the science of fueling smarter and performing better. Powered by FuelIn, the AI-driven nutrition app for endurance athletes, we're here to share expert insights, training tips, and strategies to help you fuel your best and reach your peak performance. I'm Scott Tyndall, Chief Nutrition Officer at FuelIn, and today I'm joined by our Chief Performance Officer, Jan Frodeno, and also Dr. Andy Sparks from Maurten. Guys, welcome.
Hey, Scott.
Good
How are we
morning.
doing?
How's it going, Scott?
Very good, very good. I know it's early in the morning. I was going to say that, Andy, I know it is early, and Jan, I know it's early for you, and you had a late night last night getting back from your trips abroad. I'm excited about this one, Andy, just given your level of expertise in nutritional science and your academic background, which I think we'll touch on. I'll give you a very brief introduction, and then I think we'll just let you sort of talk about yourself for a little bit and let everyone know what you've been up to. So hopefully I get this right. Dr. Andy Sparks is an exercise physiologist and UK academic who now serves as Research Innovations Manager at Maurten. His work centres on ergogenic aids, especially sodium bicarbonate, and he remains an honorary visiting research fellow at Liverpool John Moores University. In short, Andy's one of the brains behind Maurten systems and actually helps the athletes use them properly. He has 95 research publications to his name. It is early in the morning, and I want to give a big welcome to you, Andy Sparks. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Scott. Thanks for the intro. No pressure on me then for that. After that,
Yeah, I feel absolutely. If you've got a manager in your title and you don't have an officer, it's a genuine title. I feel like we make up all these titles, and everyone's called an officer these days. But if you've got a proper manager, then you're still a genuine position.
Absolutely.
yeah.
Tell us about the current research, Andy. I mean, it's been fascinating where it's all come from. How did you get into the field, and what sparked your interest? Excuse the pun.
I've not heard that one before.
I'm sure. It is early in the morning. I'll pay for.
It's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, I did an undergrad degree at John Moores actually, and I'm that old that at the time it was fairly easy to sort of bimble into the next thing without having to think about it or plan it in advance. Where I think that, for undergrad students now, you have to have mapped out a plan a little bit more. So I ended up doing a PhD because I couldn't really think about what else to do. And I was kind of fortunate because I decided that that route allowed me to sort of design my entire PhD rather than have one mapped out for me, which meant that I could focus on endurance sport, which is what I was interested in, and manipulating environment and then manipulating food and fuel availability. So I was kind of really lucky, more by luck than judgment, I'll be honest. And then I ended up in that sort of position. And then I did a load of teaching roles, moving around the UK at various universities, and then settled into a role. And I was there for about I was an academic for about 25 years. So obviously you don't last that long teaching and researching a topic if you don't really like the topic. So I managed to sort of chip away and do quite a few publications along the way, worked with some really good groups, collaborated sort of nationally and internationally with quite a few people. And then we had the idea, one of my colleagues and I at the time, to manipulate some of the sort of sodium bicarbonate timings. So it's a really well-known researcher in sodium bicarbonate, which is Lars McNaughton. We did quite a number of studies together on the basis that we noticed that there was a study from 2014 which showed really, really varied differences between the ingestion time responses to peak bicarbonate with traditional methods of delivery, and it looked very odd that we thought, well, why are we giving this sort of standard ingestion time if everyone's ingestion time looks completely different? and that sort of re-sparked, using that pun again, that really reinvigorated the research in that area. There was a couple of people doing a few bits and pieces, but if you look at the sort of sheer volume of sodium bicarbonate research from 2016 onwards, it's expanded quite rapidly, and off the back of that, we then sort of had this idea about, can we reduce some of the GI issues using pharmaceutical methods, and then that allowed me to publish a few of those papers. I had a PhD student, Nathan Hilton, do some work on that, and then Maurten got in contact because they were thinking about using a hydrogel system to sort of do what the encapsulation of the pharmaceutical grade capsules was doing, but using hydrogel technology instead, and see if that was more effective, because they thought it would be. And that's how we ended up sort of collaborating, really. I was a sort of acted in a sort of consultant capacity for them, and then we had some money off them to do some of the basic research. So the studies by Lewis Goff and I, those two studies, we had some financial support for those from Maurten prior to when I worked with them. And then, COVID kind of made everyone sort of reevaluate their current situation. And whilst we were meant to do much of that work during 2020, but that was obviously postponed. Various things happened in terms of how that product was developed because of that. And then the product was commercially available in 2023. But it was tested extensively in the pro peloton prior to that. And anyway, that sort of reevaluation part of that was, I fancy a change. So, this seemed like a company with a similar sort of moral compass. So that's why I've not quite entirely jumped ship from academia, because I'm still publishing things and still got this honorary research fellowship. So still involved in academia, but less so. And I've got some PhD students who are just about to finish, hopefully this year. So.
Amazing. Honestly, I have so many questions, but the first one, just before we go into the science, you said you have an interest in endurance sports, and you said you've been around for 25 years diving into these topics. Are you actually active yourself? Is that what kind of got you going? I often find that great breakthroughs and great fields of interest are developed because of a personal need, or personal deeper interest. Are you inclined that way at all?
Yeah, so I got into endurance sports as an undergrad because a couple of my really good friends and we had a bet to see who could do the Great North Run fastest. And it was right at the end of the academic year, and in May we then trained over the summer, and then it was actually this weekend Great North Run happened in the northeast of the UK, and it was 1996, I think, so it's a long time ago. I won the bet.
Good man.
So it was a £5 bet. So it was. It's not
inflation has driven that up a bit. Did you do it this last weekend?
No, I didn't do it this last week. The last half marathon I did was Gothenburg in May, but I just trundled around. I didn't go particularly quick. I ride a bike more now, so I managed to sort of get into did some multi-sport events, but I don't really particularly enjoy swimming too much. So duathlons rather than that. And then running.
That makes two of us, Andy. Don't worry.
Yes. I find it claustrophobic and a bit. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Quite happy to sit on a turbo trainer for multiple hours, but won't do 100 lengths in a pool because it's boring. It's a bit strange.
Boring and claustrophobic are two different things.
I find it both, so that's maybe why I don't do it.
Fair enough. That's weighing quite heavily against swimming.
So I train probably between maybe 7 and 10 hours a week. So.
Okay. Good. Yeah, still into it.
That's pretty good. Andy, I know just a couple of things you touched on there. Obviously, it sounds like your level of interest was in sodium bicarbonate, and then Maurten came to you. And then as a result of that, I guess, relationship, you decided, this company looks of interest. Can you just go into that a little bit more? Because I guess there is this perception that researchers moving across to a company, it's like moving to the dark side. And I know we've joked about this, but do you want to just give your insights on maybe that reason why you did actually move, not necessarily fully out of academia, as you said, but you actually made that sort of that step across into the commercial world?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few challenges in higher education. Part of that is it's really difficult to get money to fund making people ride bikes and run faster. It's not impossible, but it's quite difficult.
I'll do it for free.
Yeah, it's not impossible to get people to volunteer for projects. It's become much more difficult than it ever used to be. But I think getting money for those projects, because it's not just like, if you're going to investigate, nutritional strategy, it's not just getting hold of the raw ingredients that's the issue, or the supplements. That's usually, companies are only usually too pleased to sort of send you those things for free, or at least at a very reduced rate. The major issue is really, if you're going to do anything mechanistic with blood, then it becomes really, really expensive. And one of the reasons I actually got involved with the sodium bicarbonate stuff is that it was just an easier thing to do than storing blood samples, because there's all sorts of additional regulations. If you're not doing point of care blood analysis like glucose lactates from finger pricks or earlobes, or acid base balance using a radiometer, or those sorts of simple analyses that are done in just several minutes, where the waste is contained either in a cartridge or it's disposed of there and then. If you're storing anything with human tissue in, it becomes much, much more tricky. Much more bureaucratic and much more difficult and costly to do it. And the beauty of doing that sort of finger prick or earlobe stuff is it's almost instantaneous. So if you're working with athletes, you can give them really mechanistic insights, but you can do it really, really quickly there and then, pretty much. So it's a really useful thing to do. And it's one of the reasons, just out of sheer ease, that I thought, it's really difficult now to store this blood. It was so easy when I was a PhD student. It was largely unregulated, to be perfectly honest. We were very safe in terms of, biological hazards, but in terms of tracking samples and making sure that, you have to digitally now have a sample which is tracked and linked to a consent form, and it has to be in a particular location, and it needs to be identifiable so that you can remove it if someone removes their consent. It's really, really much more difficult than it ever used to be. And, maybe I kind of lost patience with some of that and thought, do you know what, we'll just do finger pricks, point of care stuff. And what can we get away with? Bicarb's perfect because all of the analysis is point of care. So, and then that's how it, that and the fact that Lars was working with us at the time, that it made perfect sense to move into that sort of field. So, we published quite a number of studies, had quite a few PhD students doing work on that, and as a result, we sort of ended up with a fairly renowned research group doing that work. There was a research group in Brian Saunders works with in Sao Paulo, so it was them and us, I guess. We had some crossover at times doing sort of collaborative work, but they were pretty much the two driving forces in some of this recent developments. So it was super interesting. So that they reached out to me initially, and one of my PhD students, who was one of my PhD students, Lewis Goff. So we still do some work together on various projects. He's obviously now moved on, made prof. He stayed in academia and done really well. And so I guess you kind of. It's interesting you should say that, Scott, that this dark side comment, I have heard that a few times, oddly enough, but I just find it a little bit ironic. I think it feels more like the light side, because actually I can do studies a little bit more agile. I can do them quicker. I've got access to be able to fund some projects, whereas, I don't have to scratch around for a few $1,000s here and there. It's much easier. I've got access to really amazing athletes, which makes life even better potentially. So it's not the dark side by any means, I think. And there is a bit of irony there, really, because many of the people that have said that to me are also taking funding from industry for their work. So I find that a bit ironic, to be perfectly honest. So.
Well, it is kind of, it is one of those things when you look at human performance studies Much of them obviously come out of military funding, because that seems like, historically one of the most beneficial kind of study partners. But I did actually wonder that, because, of course, I love Maurten. I'm with Maurten all the time. But when I look for a study, like, the first thing that I've been taught to look for is who funded the study. And that was a genuine interest, because I totally agree with what you're saying. Like, there is a genuine interest, and it's kind of weird, right? That you're just trying to drive science, but of course there is a commercial interest behind it. And I think that's probably more what Scott was referring to. That, it just, I was wondering for you as an academic, yes, how you also ensure that, the study isn't favored in one direction, because of course that's what everybody's going to say. When Nestle comes out and tells you should drink Actimel yogurts because Dr. So-and-so said so, it's great for you, then that's probably more where that image comes from, right?
Yeah, I think part of it though is also to do with, it's not just about the affiliations. I think you have to read also quite carefully the sort of conflict of interest statement, and it doesn't tell you absolutely everything. In terms of what it doesn't tell you is the nature of the relationship. So it won't tell you what, if there is a research contract between the funding body and the academics, it doesn't tell you, for instance, is there a pre-agreed set of terms which says, if the findings are potentially not favourable for the product, does this mean we now can't publish it? So some research agreements very much look like that, whereas others, there's a 5-year moratorium. So the data is collected ages ago, and then, the company has moved on to something else. And then all of a sudden the data comes out, shows that perhaps it's not as effective. Whereas, I think as an academic moving into industry, you have to be comfortable with the sort of the moral compass of whoever you're working with. And I think my understanding and my feel before I even moved to Maurten was that there's this strong sense of moral compass, which is, we will quite happily fund things, and if it shows that there's no improvement or no difference, then that's fine, we'll let you publish it. So, I think that's one of these sort of key things. And of course, not publishing what in academia terms we'd often call negative findings. So actually it's not necessarily negative, it's just not positive. It doesn't mean, but actually some of those findings are probably even more important at times, because it stops researchers going down rabbit holes that are unnecessary. And also, it also overinflates the power of a meta-analysis, because the only stuff that's freely available in the literature is stuff that shows an effect. So, it's very, there is this publication bias at times, that where editors and editors in chief are quite keen when something comes across their desk to put things into peer review when there's this new exciting finding. It's very much like the sensational, newspaper journalist looking for the next big story. Actually, perhaps it's more difficult as an academic to publish things that aren't as exciting because there's no effect. But actually, those no effect studies are really important.
Can I just on that? So you obviously, when you had dealings with Maurten, you felt like the moral compass was there. Jan, I guess I'm interested. You historically very low carb athlete, as we've touched on many times, and carb adverse at times. You then get involved with a company like Maurten. I'd love to know why you decided to move to a company like Maurten. What was it that drew you to them? Was it the taste of the gel? Was it the consistency? Was it the research behind it? Was something like the moral compass of the company? Like, how did that relationship start?
Well, for me, it's much easier than for Andy, because I'm a sample of one. I have to test on myself whether it works. And if it does work, or if I think it works, that's also fine. That's also already enough. Then that's kind of fantastic. And, we've talked about it a few times, but my world record attempt in Roth in 2016, I had 2 gels, one at 1/3 of the marathon, kilometer 14, one at 28. And that brings you to snap bang 50 grams of carbs for a marathon. And, from there on in, from what we know now, it was quite simple. And Maurten were the ones who got me onto the high carb, onto taking anything at all, onto consuming any calories at all. And that was my first race in 2018 at 70.3 Worlds in South Africa. It was the first time ever that I took on any nutrition during the half marathon of a half Ironman. So, the effects worked well. I didn't kind of fade out for the second half of the marathon. And I obviously don't have any academic rigor, or I don't need to prove this for a broad sample. It just, I felt like $1,000,000, or as we like to say, I felt Olympic, and that's it. Then that is enough for me. And I mean, it's a great team, and all this kind of research that is coming out, we're obviously privy to a little bit earlier, because we're also in some sense the guinea pigs, and happy to do so, because, well, there is just so much out there, and there are so many supplements that, to Andy's point, I'd love to find a few more adverse findings, so that, the protocol wouldn't become wider and wider before every race. You start carb loading, you start this loading, and then there's the cherry juice, and there's beetroot juice, then there's that. And I'm sure, in 10 years, people are going to be shaking their heads, and they're going to be like, no, we should have just done it this way, to some of those things, of course. And it's exciting to be at the forefront of that, because as an athlete, you're obviously always looking for an edge. And I don't know how it took so long to get onto carbs as an edge, but from there on, it obviously goes more and more into it. I mean, you look at bicarb. The first stories I heard about bicarb was around the 90s. Barcelona, Atlanta Olympics, track cycling. They were, trying simple bicarb of soda, and had protocols that started, probably 2 hours out, depending on their body weight. And it was a 50-50 joker whether you'd make it to the start line or a last-minute bathroom stop. And that's why I think we as athletes are just immensely grateful for guys like Andy, who make it that much easier and that much more carefree, and lets you focus on the actual essence of racing.
Yeah, I love it. Did Maurten ever get you in to do any testing? Did you do any physiological testing or anything like that with the higher carb intake at the time?
Testing less about the carbs. The carbs was probably more a performance thing, where I could just see that it lasted. We did do some testing around bicarb, intervals, kind of 10-minute intervals on the trainer, measuring how long it lasts, what kind of the effects are in terms of a blood level. And the guys actually came around, and we did a little test here in my garage, and brought around all the machines, which is how you want it as an athlete, because as an athlete you're really focused, especially as a triathlete. You've got to get out there 3 times a day, and the luxury of being able to integrate it into your sessions is obviously one of those things where Maurten just invests into their athletes.
Yeah, I love it. Andy, well, since we're talking about bicarb, I was going to sort of go into gels and carbohydrates, but since we're talking about bicarb so much, do you want to give us maybe a 101 in what sodium bicarbonate is and how it interacts with the body, just so the listeners can understand a little bit about what your research is centered on, and then we can get into the actual Maurten product?
Yeah, sure. So the sodium bicarbonate as an intervention has been around for a really long time. I think the first study was 1930. That was at the Harvard Fatigue Lab, 1930 and 1931, so quite a while. And the observations there were that when you run on a treadmill to exhaustion, you can run for longer. And also you produce, or what is observed at the time, it was called lactic acid, but we now know that lactic acid doesn't actually occur in humans. It's a bit of a red herring. And we know also that it's an important fuel. So, lactate is elevated in a situation where you have alkalosis, which is induced by giving bicarbonate. And bicarbonate as a raw ingredient, is used in baking and cleaning. I mean, it seems to do absolutely everything. But from an ergogenic perspective, the idea is to enhance a buffering system which allows you to deal with changes in pH. So when the muscle's really active, it creates hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions change the pH to make it more acid in the muscle. The pH is then altered in the what we call the extracellular fluid or the blood, and then those hydrogen ions cause that change. But we have a naturally occurring blood bicarbonate buffering system, which basically changes the hydrogen ions which are produced into water and carbon dioxide, and you essentially breathe that out. So the system works by really effectively, but you have a finite amount of bicarbonate available. Now you can enhance that slightly and how effective it is at dealing with these changes in acidity based on doing interval sessions like you were talking about, Jan. So actually being more physically active, you become more fatigue resistant because you'll enhance that naturally occurring bicarbonate system. And all that the sodium bicarbonate, when you ingest it, is trying to do is increase that that capacity, so you're able to have a larger buffering capacity. So that's really the sort of crux of the traditional way of looking at this.
And so you mentioned that it's a cleaning product and also used in baking goods. I imagine the early studies just used sodium bicarbonate that you could typically just purchase at the grocery store. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just go to the supermarket and then tip it in some water and drink it, and it's like falling in the ocean. Yeah.
I mean, I'll be honest, that's what I've done. If I've used sodium bicarbonate, and I imagine, Jan, you would have in your early days just used stock standard sodium bicarbonate. The results for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I used it without a scale, so definitely mixed results. It was either baking or it was cleaning. It was cleaning me out in a way you don't necessarily want to see.
Yeah, it will certainly do that if you get the dose wrong. Yeah, that's the only bad thing as well about being like reasonably well trained, is that whenever I had a PhD student wanting to test this, I was always guinea pig number one.
Yeah, I mean it's just crazy to see where it all comes from. But speaking on that, just you touched on the performance aspect, and I remember infamously Grant Hackett used to be the first person to actively imply this as a racing strategy, and people always thought he was suicidal because he would go out the first 100 of his 1500 meter so much harder than was deemed sensible to pace. And it was this strategy that he'd adopted, or so he said anyways, that he basically wanted to use the lactate as a fuel. I mean, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting concept. George Brooks is the one from the US who has very much championed the sort of redefining and re-understanding of what we know about the difference between lactic acid, and the fact that it's a really important fuel. So it's shuttled between, when it's produced in one muscle, it's shuttled to other muscles and it reforms glucose. So, without it, you're actually very, very exercise intolerant. So it makes sense that if you can enhance your both production of it. So we know that if you have a high carb diet, you'll have a higher amount of lactate being produced. It's a byproduct of carbohydrate metabolism, essentially. So it's one of those end products of glycolysis. You break down carbohydrate and you increase lactate concentration. So somebody who's on a low carb diet, when if you measure their lactate, it should be slightly lower because they've got less carb availability, less carb oxidation. So, and then if you have a high carb diet, you obviously have more carbs available, so your lactate goes up. And then with the across the board in almost every sodium bicarbonate study, you'll see that there are both at rest slightly elevated by lactate concentrations, but also you see that the concentration is much higher, particularly in like a time trial or a study where it's do as much as you can in a particular period, because you can tolerate a change in acidity so much more with bicarb. It allows you to essentially turn over more carbohydrate and therefore also produce more lactate. So you see both of these things, and it might well be that additional lactate production is also then fueling exercise, certainly for longer duration stuff. So I think one of the other things that you're doing, because you're changing pH not just in the blood but also in the muscle, there's a really strong case to say that actually if you can maintain at really high intensity efforts more optimal conditions, there's a good chance that actually the optimal conditions are present for longer, which means that actually carb turnover is probably going to be ever so slightly higher with bicarbonate. But it's something that we haven't really explored in the literature that much, because people haven't typically used bicarb for long duration exercise, even though we know it works.
Andy, you probably blew many listeners' minds then with about 15 things you said, and I think we probably just need to slow it down and recap on that. It is something I hear all the time. People say, oh, isn't it if I'm on a high-carb diet, I'm going to be producing more lactate? Can we just touch on that and just give, just because it seems to be deemed as a negative because of the higher carb diet and the increased lactate production? I hear this all the time and I'm like, no. Can you just go into that a little bit more and what that would mean to an athlete and how they could become adapted, I guess, to use that lactate as a fuel source, which I think is what Jan's hinting at that Grant did, or his sort of philosophy with it?
Yeah, so efforts over threshold will produce large amounts of lactate, but getting used to doing that obviously does two things. One, it familiarizes the athlete with the sense of discomfort. So that is also a training response, tolerating discomfort and essentially dialing down your perceived exertion and that sort of negative feedback that you get. Athletes use this quite regularly when particularly cyclists, they'll turn up to races and they'll race, but not for position. They'll not necessarily they'll help out the team, but lots of it is to essentially reset that getting used to being really uncomfortable racing. So some of that's really, one of those useful things. And so if bicarb has an impact on how well you tolerate exercise, one of the mechanisms is very, very likely to be a reduced perceived exertion and that sort of negative feedback you get peripherally. So that pain perception is almost certainly involved in you being able to do more. But in terms of lactate production, yeah, we still, if you talk to the average recreational athlete, they're still talking about lactic acid and they're still talking about that being a negative thing. And you still hear like sports commentators blaming lactic acid for the reason that you've got somebody fading terribly in a race.
I heard that at the Tour de France.
Yeah, and also it's blamed for soreness the next day, and it's just
You might also see someone like David Sinclair tweeting it. Did you see that when he tweeted about lactate and Inigo San Milan just shot him down because he completely got it wrong in terms of he was calling it lactic acid in terms of production. It was very amusing to hear, like even at that level, I guess depending on what level you think he's at, but that misconception of lactate versus lactic acid and sort of how it's got these negative connotations to exercise performance.
Yeah, you still see it, and I think there's a really mixed bag in terms of coaching and athlete expertise. Some are not really bothered; they're not really that interested in understanding what is happening mechanistically and what actually the most recent publications and information are saying. Whereas others are really, really interested and really kind of attention to detail. There's a real mixed bag of approaches. But you're right. A lot of athletes think it's a negative thing when in actual fact, it's providing additional fuel.
Are you seeing if someone is on a high carb diet and therefore theoretically producing more lactate, do you see like a steeper rise in that lactate once they go over that threshold of their ability to cope with it? Is that something that you have observed? Is that potentially something that is sort of a pitfall, even though it's going to happen? Is the rise in lactate faster for those on a high carb diet?
I've not noticed that personally. I think it'll depend on the training status of the individual and what type of training they're doing. And that sort of tolerate. The thing to remember is that hydrogen ions and lactate are produced coincidentally, which is why we've always confused. Because when you bind those two molecules together, you get lactic acid. It's just that they're not produced as lactic acid and then dissociate. we've got that bit wrong. It's that there's two separate ways that they're produced. They're just produced coincidentally, so they're produced in correlation with one another as exercise intensity goes up, which is why that we've sort of made that mistake. The hydrogen ions are absolutely going to reduce contractile properties of the muscle. They are going to induce some fatigue. It's just that we've added 2 and 2 together and come up with the wrong number. That's essentially what's happened, because we've just made the assumption that the two things are coming from the same source, but they're not.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. And I mean, I've obviously being in the field, but also not being scientifically kind of diving into these kind of topics over my career. And I always thought, that later on in my career, lower lactic acid production was due to age rather than diet. And I was definitely on a high fat, probably at times high carb diet, but definitely not as much as, not during the sessions. Is that something that in your experience rings true? Does age come into it at all, or is it really a nutritional thing?
It's mostly a nutritional thing, but then with age in a recreational athlete, I guess you get usually declines in muscle mass, so your ability to produce it might go down, but then also the likelihood is you've got a reduction in over time in mitochondrial number. So actually working really aerobically might also potentially be less economical, which means that you might produce more hydrogen ions. So it's a double-edged sword, and the training status will interfere with that. The muscle mass will potentially interfere with that. So there's lots of things going on there, but the reality is that it's lactate and hydrogen ions. Well, lactate particularly is more related to dietary status in terms of carb availability. Because if you haven't got enough fuel, you can't turn over loads of carbohydrate because it's just not there to use. Once you're out of muscle glycogen and you're not fueling properly, then you will see a decline. 1, because there's not much fuel available, and 2, because exercise intensity will undoubtedly decline.
Well, yeah, I mean, it definitely is something that has changed significantly in terms of the perception of it. We've already heard about my ancient fueling tactics on a marathon. 50 grams. I hope no one who's racing world champs this coming weekend follows the same tactic. There is a huge carb rush going on at the moment in terms of what people advocate for. Obviously, we're at FuelIn. Scott, this is something that you've brought to my attention. Where is it at the moment? We hear rumors of athletes taking 200 grams of carbs an hour. Then the practices, vary entirely. What's your take on the current state of the carb rush and best practices?
Yeah, I guess part of this has come from people really being able to tolerate large amounts of carbohydrate when, 10 or 15 years ago, there was this upper ceiling whereby, it's a threshold you should never cross because it won't do you any good, but it won't do you any good in that instance because, anything over 90 grams per hour in any situation was so volatile that it was very difficult to actually keep it down anyway. And if you did keep it down after a couple of hours of doing that, you weren't able to continue at that rate because your lower GI system had some problems. So I think things have changed because of tolerability of carbohydrates and also because you can consume large volumes of carbohydrates in smaller volumes of product. So it's because it's slightly more concentrate. So that means that you can consume in a marathon, for instance, if you're an elite runner, you have access to your nice little numbered bottle, little flag on the top. And so because you've got you've got access to those, you're not waiting for a relative as a recreational runner to make sure you spot them hanging out of the crowd with the right bottle. So fueling's a little bit easier logistically in an elite race than it is for the average runner, but that means that, you can fuel really aggressively, and we see athletes, upwards of 150 grams per hour in a marathon.
In a marathon?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, I'd heard about cycling numbers like that, but in a marathon, I
Yeah.
mean, the stress on your GI tract is obviously mechanically so much higher.
Yeah, I mean it's different though for an elite runner, isn't it? Because they're running for a little over 2 hours, whereas your average club runner is running for 3, 4 hours. So mechanical damage there is arguably going to be slightly higher. Carbohydrate demand in a recreational runner is going to be lower anyway because they're not able to exercise at such a high percentage of max. They're also, they're not well trained and as well trained as the elites, so their carb turnover is lower. So these thresholds are really interesting, and this arms race in how much one person versus the next can consume is also super interesting. But in reality, for the average runner, they don't need 120 grams per hour necessarily if they're taking 4 or 5 hours to do a marathon. It's just not necessarily required.
Andy, you mentioned a couple of things there. Sorry, Jan.
So I'm good at doing 10 things at once. Sorry
I
about
know.
that.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of things. I'm always like trying to remember the first one. You mentioned about I think you said something about the tolerance for higher amounts of carbohydrates. Are you referring to that improvement because of habitual intake of carbohydrates is increased? Is that what you're referring to there?
Yeah, it's a multitude of things. So the first thing is that from probably 10 or 15 years ago, gut training became a thing. So there's a paper from Maskayukandrup, I think, in 2014 about gut training. So I mean, interestingly, when I was training for that bet in 1996, I was inadvertently gut training because I had a really rubbish part-time job as a student, and then that was a fairly manual job, and then I'd ride my bike home a couple of miles, and then I'd eat my dinner because I was at the end of the day I was really, really hungry, and then about half an hour later I'd go for an hour run. I would do that almost every day of the week. And so I remember the first couple of weeks trying that and just feeling absolutely dreadful on that run. But within about 4 or 5 weeks, I could eat a huge bowl of pasta and then just go for a run, no problem. and then how many years later, there's this study on gut training. I was doing it inadvertently, but actually consuming meals close to the start of exercise is one way to increase that. Actually, interestingly, that approach, Jan, of having low carb availability in a low carb available situation where you're habitually reducing carb intake, you actually down regulate the carbohydrate transporters in the gut. And then when you reintroduce carbohydrate in high amounts, you upregulate the number of those transporters. So if you're habitually used to having lots of carbohydrate in your diet and during exercise, your absorption rate goes up.
Well, that's
so
what
there is that approach, yeah.
Well, that's what. Yeah, I was interested to hear your take on that because we were at Dr. Alan McCubbin and I were discussing this, and it's like and you touched on something else there. The research always trying to catch up with what's done in the field, and what if I can call you an elite athlete at that point in time, what the athletes are doing is often ahead of the science. But what we're seeing now when we're hearing about these huge intakes, 180, 200 grams or whatever an hour. 150 grams running, which is, very high amounts. Do you think it's like we need to see research actually looking at these type of athletes now, not just the regular Joes? Because I think there's this confusion as well. Like there is this carb rush, as Jan described it, where we're hearing stories of these elite athletes, cyclists, runners doing these huge amounts. And I think the amateur athlete is getting confused with this and thinking, well, I need to do the same amount. Where do you sit on that? And where, from a personal and a perspective of Maurten, where do you guys sort of try and toe the line and explain to athletes how much carbs should they be focusing on to maximize performance, but also, I guess, not come under undue stress or waste money, I guess, even in that sense?
Yeah, I think these sorts of really, really high intakes, we've seen Tour de France riders take over 200 grams per hour for like 4 hours, which is astonishing amounts of carbohydrate. if you're going on a Sunday club run, you really don't, you don't need that amount at all. I guess that the sensible thing to do, because if you can't directly measure what's going on, and actually measuring carbohydrate oxidation from the stuff that you're ingesting is pretty complex. You need to use carbon-13 labeling or naturally occurring carbon-13 in some products, and you need to look at how much of that is being used. That's quite tricky. You need a mass spectrometer to do that, and you need breath samples at various time periods. So that's not that easy. It's something that we are doing with some of our athletes, so that we can actually look to see what their carb oxidation rates actually are. We're seeing, very, very high carb oxidation rates, higher than is in the literature. And the reason for that is, you touched on perfectly, Scott, is that there is a distinct difference between an elite athlete and a club runner or a club cyclist. That they're genetically they're different, and also training status, they are different. They're in such good state and they're so adapted to really high levels of carb turnover that their carb demand is so much higher than the average runner. And so for the average runner, I guess, you start at using a trial and error approach, because that's the best way to do it. You start and have some carbohydrate intake, maybe go, if you're not sure about a particular product, you start low, because you don't want to, be an hour away from home and have a bit of a trouser moment. So, you want to start at a low level and see what you can tolerate. So, I mean, Jan, your first experiences of gel ingestion is 50 grams per hour. It's a tiny amount, relatively speaking, compared to what is typically done now. But actually,
2.5 hours.
Yeah, so if
15,
if
2.5.
well, if we'd have said to that at that point, you should easily be able to ingest 200 grams, you'd have just gone, no chance.
Yeah.
Why would I do that?
If you read some of the kind of early stage literature around the sub 2, where they were trying to get guys to consume 150 grams throughout the marathon, people, the same thing, the runners were just shaking their heads. Which brings me to the point that if you're saying it's not in the literature, I mean, it's exciting times for us as athletes, but it must be exciting as well for you as a researcher to actually, break some new tracks and discover things that are genuinely making headway in such what we thought was well-researched field.
Yeah, and I think that is one of those things that's super interesting about having moved out of academia into this sort of industrial, we'll call it industrial, into industry, an industrial setting, is that actually what becomes fascinating is to think about the sheer amount of research that has already been done, but is just sat on a hard disk somewhere. And I think, there is an awful lot of elite athlete data there. And people keep it to themselves because of a commercial interest and a competitive interest, or competitive edge, that athletes don't necessarily always want to give this information away. Some of it, of course, is just not that commercially or performance sensitive. And I think as people working with elite athletes, we should definitely be looking to do, and we are looking to do more with this data, because it moves the field on enormously. Because, I still hear at conferences about, these upper limits of carb ingestion, and they're based on data from recreational athletes, because that's only people that will do a muscle biopsy or will be recruited into a study.
And that was exactly the point, Andy. Yeah. That's exactly
There's this disconnect, isn't there?
Yeah. I think we have to see that, so it will change that literature, won't it?
Yeah.
Even we're hearing 60 grams of glucose used to be the upper level, and now they're sort of saying maybe it's 80 grams just for glucose alone. And, again, for someone who takes in a lot of carbs, maybe they can tolerate with higher amounts of that. And then we start to see, okay, if they do take in that exogenous amount of glucose, can they actually, cope with that and utilize it? And then we start layering in the fructose on top of that. What is that level? And I think it will be rewritten. That is my general fear. Well, it's just my feeling that I think, based on these early reports, the elite athletes will rewrite the sort of science books on what is possible.
Yeah, and we're in a really fortunate position because we've got access to amazing athletes. So, it's I feel like I'm in a really good position in terms of like what we can do research wise.
I want to hear about the bicarb system. You explained about sodium bicarbonate and what it does. Can you just go into a bit of information around what is special about the Maurten product and why is it so expensive? Because that is one of the questions I get from a lot of athletes. They're like, it's so bloody expensive compared to, say, going and buying sodium bicarbonate from the baking section. Can we just go into that and then how it's proposed to work and what's been studied as well? I'm throwing a lot of elements in here. What's been studied and then what the results were. So starting with what the product is and what the technology is behind it.
Okay, so the product has got a 40-gram carbohydrate viscous mix, which is the hydrogel essentially. And then the other component of the system is sodium bicarbonate mini tablets. So they kind of look like artificial sweeteners that you might put in tea and coffee. They're not the same though. You know, the way that they're produced is quite expensive. And you know, I know I've got a Maurten badge on, but I would argue actually it's not that expensive. If you have 4 major performance goals for your competitive season, there are 4 portions in the kit, and so actually per performance, you know, it's not that expensive when you think about, you know, how much money people would potentially spend on a weekly basis on whey protein, for instance. You know, actually, it's not that dear. But the point here is if you compare it to the pharmaceutical methods that we were using in the studies that we did before I worked for Maurten, and you use really good quality pharmaceutical grade enterically coated capsules for delivering bicarb to bypass the stomach acid, they're really expensive. They're way more expensive than the Maurten bicarb system per dose. You know, we're talking $40 to $50 or euros thereabouts per dose. And there are manufacturers that are making these sort of systems, but you know, they're selling them at lower prices than that. But you know, if you look at the quality of some of those capsules, they're not the same as the really expensive ones that we used in those studies. So you don't get the same gastro-resistant effects. And also, one of the things that isn't in some of those studies is that actually you get GI problems from a lower GI perspective, maybe 5 to 8 hours after you've ingested it. So you're storing up trouble for later if you use that method anyway. You'll get through your single bout of exercise unless you're doing, you know, an Ironman, and then you probably won't. You'll have a very lively marathon if you decide to use that approach. But the reality is that if you're delivering bicarb by the traditional methods, there's a good chance that you'll have either upper GI problems or you'll have lower GI problems later. And what we see with the Maurten system is that you don't get that either upper or lower, but because you're not interacting the bicarbonate with stomach acid, you're not losing bicarbonate either. So when you deliver bicarbonate through a traditional method and it interacts with the stomach acid, that bloating sensation is the bicarbonate reacting with stomach acid and producing CO2. So you burp a lot, you get bloating, but actually you're reducing the effectiveness of the bicarbonate you've ingested because you're not delivering all of it. So by stopping that from happening and delivering it into the gut lumen, the total delivery of bicarb is larger. With the
in a traditional sense, if you did consume it, say in a carb drink mix, would that offset some of that?
So yeah, if you look at the work that Amelia Carr did and the recommendations that they have subsequently produced for bicarb ingestion alongside the Australian Institute of Sport guidelines, it does recommend that you ingest some carbohydrate at the same time, and that will reduce some of the GI upset if you use a traditional method. So it does have an effect. So part of the system is, yes, the carbohydrate is co-ingested, but that's not the whole story. It's the nature of the carbohydrate viscous hydrogel mix protecting the mini tablets from the stomach acid, but then also the nature of how the mini tablets are made also means that they're gastro resistant to an extent when they're ingested with the carbohydrate mix. So it's that
Okay.
two component parts. So if you looked in the patent for that, it's the two parts that are important.
And what does that mean for, Joe or Jane who want to go out and they want to test this product? I mean, we couldn't have anyone else give better practical advice for our listeners in terms of what's the best practice? Like what's the protocol that you recommend for somebody who hasn't dived into it, who's curious about trying it? I don't think try it on race day, please. I know you spoke to 4 major performances. Just please take a hard session or something, test it there.
By two.
Yeah. We have this mantra across the board of never try anything new on race day ever. It's interesting because sometimes I go and help out at marathon expos and things and cycling trade shows and stuff, and people will ask you all sorts of questions, and very often they'll say, I've heard about your gels. They're meant to be really good. I want to buy 8 for tomorrow. And I'm like, no, don't do that because you haven't tried them before. We're pretty sure you won't have a problem, but you'll blame us if you do. So don't do that. No, never try anything new on race day. Always try things in training. I would say at least twice, just to make sure. One of the things that we did, Lewis and I did in the studies on the Maurten bicarb system, is that we deliberately recruited people who had previously had really bad GI upset with traditional ingestion methods, and then we got them to come back and try a traditional method, but also try the Maurten bicarb system. And we did that deliberately without a breakfast. Now, the guidance for the product is actually you have a breakfast about 4 hours out from the start of exercise. And then you ingest between 120 and 90 minutes before the start of the exercise bout is when you have the bicarb system. And that very much varies based on how you're going to deliver bicarb. So if you have a liquid, the time to sort of peak bicarb availability is much shorter. And one of the reasons why I became interested in this sort of area is that actually there's lots of inter-individual variability. So some people's peaks like 20 minutes after ingestion. In which case, actually, if you have it an hour late if you perform an hour after you've ingested, you might have missed some of that peak effectiveness. And then if you have it in capsules, the time is different to when it's most effective. With gastro-resistant ones, the time is even longer. But also you change the sort of kinetics of how bicarb works. So the total area under that bicarb curve, so how much is available over a time period, is larger with gastro-resistant technology, but the peak in terms of the change in bicarbonate is a little lower. With the Maurten bicarb system, we see, certainly in the stuff we've published, that we have a high peak, but then also a long tail and less individual variability. So if we stick with 90 minutes or 120 minutes, you're almost certain to have a good bicarb response by the time you start exercising.
Are you seeing that peak a little bit more standardized? Because you mentioned if they're not using those enteric sort of coated tablets or the traditional system, it's quite variable. Are you seeing a little bit more consistency and predictability about what the peak level would be, and what would that peak level look like?
Yes,
in terms of timing.
Yes, that peak level is between sort of 90 and 120 minutes, which is why we've got that guidance. And there is definitely less variability. And part of that is if you take the example of using like gelatin capsules, which is again, a widely researched technique, widely used by athletes to ingest, or vegetarian equivalents. Sometimes what you'll see is that when you ingest those tablets, they'll stick together, but they do so in a fairly unrepeatable manner. So it will very much depend what's in your stomach, and then also how active you are once you've ingested them. And also the size of those capsules changes the time to peak as well. So if you've got lots of little ones, you've got a big surface area, whereas if you've got lots of big ones, they're more likely to stick together. So actually just the way that you ingest it changes those dynamics enormously. And I guess that's why, when people sort of generically make comments about how effective bicarbonate is, you can't do that. It's very specific to how you've ingested it. And that's why, what we're saying is, this system is anecdotally with our athletes, but also in terms of some lab studies and lab data collection stuff that we've done, there is a difference between this method and some of the stuff which is reported in the literature.
You mentioned the Australian Institute of Sport because they have it listed as like a primary ergogenic aid, I think, in that class A. In terms of dosage, it does vary a little bit in the research. What is the dosage in terms of a gram per kilogram that you're using in the system, and why is that?
So we use like a traffic light system. So you put, we've got an online calculator. So you basically put your weight in, and then it will tell you what systems. We use a numbered system from 12 to 22, 25, and that it represents grams of sodium bicarbonate delivery. And the plumb in the green of the traffic light system is 0.25 grams. If you look in the literature, traditionally it's 0.3 grams, which is the most common dose used. But again, that's really come from liquid or gelatin capsule ingestion, looking at which dose is most effective for performance. But you have to remember that if you deliver it that way, you're going to lose some. So actually, if you deliver more using that method, you should get a sort of comparative amount of delivery to that 0.25 gram dose with the Maurten bicarb system. But the reason it's not done is when you go to 0.4, your gut becomes very, very lively. And the proportion of people with lively guts at that point is far higher than it is at 0.3. And the original research, that dose response study work that was done at 0.4, there's little or no difference in performance. At 0.5, there's little or no difference in performance, but the GI upset is, fairly catastrophic.
Did you play around with higher doses initially with the Maurten product, or was it just this is the dose we're going to go with?
No, we have done in-house since though, and we know that some pro cycling teams are also doing so. Yeah, so they are messing about with that. Again, it's that thing of that Jan mentioned of, okay, well, we've got this technology, we've got this technique, but how can we individually tweak this to try and get the most out of it? So we know that people are doing that. Yeah, we know that people are also taking, liquid or gel-based bicarbonate on top of the Maurten system. So use that as an initial pre-ingestion. Yeah,
it's aggressive.
I'm pretty sure we won't see too much of Mike Woods' approach of ingesting during the World Championships during riding. We won't see that too often. I don't think that's a brilliant idea. It looked interesting.
It's funny. He's pretty much my neighbor. I had a good laugh when I saw it because we were chatting about it before. But he's one of those old school tinkerers. He just loves that kind of thing. He comes with his own energy bars wrapped up in alfoil and just that's kind of part of his spirit, I think, more than his performance.
That'll be the ex-runner in him, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Andy, we've talked about the system, sort of, I guess, the mechanistic sort of perspective of sodium bicarbonate, the product itself. What about the results? Like, I know I've seen a couple of studies that you've obviously have been funded by Maurten and run by yourself, but can you just, in real world, what are the results of what you've researched, and how does that apply to the real world in terms of, okay, elite athlete versus age grouper, and the recommendations around when, a bit like what Jan was asking, when would someone actually use this if they were going to use it, and when would you recommend that?
So the most frequent use of it is prior to competition, but we know also that some athletes are using it in training. And the reason that you might want to use it in training is also to allow you to potentially do more. So you get more training impulse, more training effect potentially. So that's interesting. If you look at the sort of potential training adaptations that might happen there is some work on that. Dave Bishop has done some work previously on that. Again, the problem we've got with the training study is that the people that you're going to get to volunteer to do that are not going to be elite athletes. They're going to be recreational athletes. And part of the reason for that is that many of the things that you're going to try and measure to sort of quantify a training response are going to be muscle biopsy based. So, an elite athlete who spends 15 years ensuring that their muscle is in prime condition is not then going to want to give you a bit of it.
I love it. Andy, mate, thank you for that. I know It probably got more into the science than I thought we were going to get, but hopefully everyone's enjoyed it. Fascinating discussion. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions generated as a result of this, but I personally want to thank you for giving up your morning and having this discussion with Jan and myself. It's, as always, it's fascinating learning from people at the top and the pointy end who are dealing with, the elite athletes and the products that are fueling them. So from myself, thank you very much for today.
Hi, thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. It's been absolutely fantastic and very insightful also for me.
Thanks, mate.